It was a calm morning in Millbrook Correctional Facility, a medium-security prison in the heart of rural Georgia. The sun was slowly rising, casting long shadows across the gray stone walls. But the silence inside the prison was shattered when a correctional officer found something that would forever change the prison's history. In cell block C, inmate James Reed, a man known for keeping to himself, was discovered dead in his cell. At first glance, it looked like he had taken his own life. A bedsheet was tied around his neck, his body hanging from the top bunk. But something wasn't right. Reed had been a model inmate, not the type to do something like this. And even more suspiciously, the bedsheet was perfectly tied, a little too perfect for someone to have done it themselves in a fit of despair. Officer Karen Sanders, who had been working the night shift, was the one who discovered the body. Her hands trembled as she radioed for backup. "We have a situation in cell block C," she said, her voice shaky. "Inmate Reed." As more officers arrived, the investigation began immediately. The prison's warden, John Miller, arrived at the scene looking grim. "Lock down the facility," he ordered. "Nobody in or out until we figure out what happened." As the investigation unfolded, whispers started circulating among the prison staff. Reed wasn't just any inmate. He had been serving a 10-year sentence for armed robbery, but he had been keeping a low profile ever since his arrival. That's why his death was so shocking. Nobody had expected it. But then, something strange started coming to light. Rumors spread that Reed had been in a secret relationship with one of the correctional officers, Officer Karen Sanders. They had met during her rounds and, over time, developed a close bond. Nobody would have suspected it. Sanders was a married woman with 2 kids, and had worked at the prison for over a decade. She was known for being tough but fair. The last thing anyone would expect was for her to be involved with an inmate. But as the investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence that couldn't be ignored. Late-night security footage showed Sanders spending long periods in front of Reed's cell, far beyond what was necessary for her rounds. Some nights she stayed for hours. Other officers started reporting that they had seen her sneaking into the cell block when she wasn't even scheduled to work. The deeper the investigation went, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Reed and Sanders had been involved in a secret affair for months. But what could have led to his death? Was it a crime of passion? Or was there something even more sinister going on? The autopsy report on James Reed confirmed what the investigators had feared all along: it wasn't a suicide. The bruising on Reed's neck didn't match the pattern of someone who had taken their own life. It was too precise, too calculated. He had been strangled, and the bedsheet had been staged to make it look like a suicide. The shocking truth was beginning to emerge. Reed hadn't taken his own life, he had been murdered. But who would want him dead and why? All eyes turned to Officer Sanders. She was the last person to see Reed alive, and her secret relationship with him was no longer a secret. Investigators started piecing together the story. Reed had wanted to come clean about their relationship. He had told Sanders that he was going to confess everything to the prison administration, hoping it would lead to some sort of leniency in his sentence. But Sanders couldn't let that happen. She had too much to lose: her job, her family, her reputation. If the affair was exposed, it would ruin her life. And so, in a desperate attempt to keep her secret hidden, she decided to silence Reed for good. The night of his murder, Sanders had gone to Reed's cell under the cover of darkness. She had convinced him to talk, to trust her one last time. But as he turned his back, she wrapped the bedsheet around his neck and pulled tight. Reed had fought, but Sanders was stronger than he expected. Within minutes, it was over. She had tried to make it look like a suicide, but her plan wasn't as flawless as she had hoped. The investigators had found her out. The day of Officer Karen Sanders' arrest was one of the most dramatic in Millbrook Correctional Facility's history. She had been on her way to work, walking through the prison gates like it was just another ordinary day. But as soon as she stepped into the facility, 2 detectives were waiting for her. "Karen Sanders," one of them said, "you're under arrest for the murder of James Reed." Her face went pale and she stumbled back. No, she muttered, her voice cracking. "I didn't do anything." But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Security footage, witness testimonies, and most damning of all, the autopsy report, all pointed to Sanders as the killer. She was handcuffed on the spot and led out of the prison, her head hanging low as her colleagues watched in stunned silence. The trial of Karen Sanders quickly became one of the most talked about legal cases in the state. News outlets covered every detail, painting her as the villainous correctional officer who had abused her position of power. The prosecution built a strong case, focusing on the affair, the motive, and the forensic evidence that tied Sanders to the murder. In court, Sanders tried to defend herself. She claimed that Reed had threatened her, that he had blackmailed her into the relationship, and that the murder had been a desperate act of self-defense. But the jury wasn't convinced. After weeks of testimonies and emotional arguments, the verdict was finally delivered: guilty. Karen Sanders was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The impact of the case was felt far beyond the walls of Millbrook Correctional Facility. For the staff, it was a reminder of the dangers that could lurk even in the most secure environments. For the community, it was a shocking scandal that left them questioning how something so tragic could happen in their small, quiet town. As for Karen Sanders, she now sits in a prison cell, not much different from the one where James Reed had spent his final moments. The woman who had once upheld the law was now living out her days behind bars, haunted by the crime she had tried so hard to cover up. And though justice had been served, the question still lingered in the air: how could someone who had once been trusted to protect others commit such a terrible act? While Karen Sanders served her sentence in a state penitentiary, whispers of another mystery began to surface. People in the town, particularly those close to Millbrook Correctional Facility, started to ask questions. Was Reed's murder really an isolated incident? Or was there something even darker happening behind the prison walls? An investigative journalist named Laura Barnes, determined to dig deeper, began her own inquiry into the case. Laura had covered crime stories for over a decade, and something about this one didn't sit right with her. How had a trusted correctional officer with no previous history of violence spiraled into murder? What was really going on during those long, silent nights at the prison? Through her investigation, Laura discovered a few unsettling facts. Several other inmates who had crossed paths with Officer Sanders had made complaints against her over the years. These complaints were quietly dismissed, written off as the lies of convicts trying to stir up trouble. But as Laura interviewed former inmates and staff, a pattern began to emerge. Rumors spread that Reed wasn't the first inmate Sanders had grown too close to. There were whispers of another inmate, a man named Marcus Hill, who had mysteriously disappeared from the prison's records after an alleged escape. But some believed Marcus never escaped. They believed he met a darker fate, one eerily similar to Reed's. Laura dug through old files and managed to track down Marcus Hill's family. They revealed that they had received a letter from Marcus shortly before his disappearance, where he mentioned an officer who had become uncomfortably close to him. He wrote about his fear, his uncertainty about what would happen if he didn't comply with her demands. It was a chilling revelation, one that suggested Karen Sanders had a history of using her position to manipulate vulnerable inmates. Laura took her findings to the state authorities, who reopened an investigation into the prison. What they uncovered was shocking. Multiple cases of misconduct had been swept under the rug, involving not only Sanders but other correctional officers who had abused their power. The prison system, it seemed, had long been riddled with corruption and secrecy. With the new evidence in hand, the case against Karen Sanders was far from over. Laura Barnes's investigation brought to light the possibility that Reed's murder was not an isolated event but part of a larger, more insidious system of abuse. The truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. As the authorities re-examined the case, they began questioning other staff members, uncovering further incidents of exploitation, intimidation, and even violence. It seemed that Sanders' actions had been enabled by a toxic environment where officers felt untouchable, protected by a culture of silence. Karen Sanders, facing the weight of these new accusations, maintained her innocence on the matter of Marcus Hill's disappearance. But the evidence against her continued to mount. Former inmates came forward, sharing their experiences, painting a grim picture of life inside Millbrook Correctional Facility. It wasn't just a place for punishment, it was a place where those in power felt they could act without consequences. The investigation culminated in a full-scale overhaul of the prison system. Several officers were terminated, and new policies were implemented to prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished unchecked for so long. For Laura Barnes, the conclusion of her investigation was bittersweet. While justice had been served for James Reed and possibly other victims, the scars left on the families and the community could never truly heal. As for Karen Sanders, she would spend the rest of her life behind bars, not just for the murder of James Reed, but for the many other wrongs that had come to light. Her name became a symbol of the dark side of the correctional system, a reminder that those meant to uphold the law could just as easily break it. Years after the case had closed, the story of James Reed and Karen Sanders continued to haunt those who had been involved. The prison underwent major reforms, and Laura Barnes was praised for her brave reporting. Her investigation had exposed a festering wound in the system, one that might have gone unnoticed had she not dug deeper. But for the families of the victims, the loss remained. Reed's mother, a quiet woman who had long since accepted her son's imprisonment, was left with nothing but unanswered questions. She would never know the full extent of the relationship between her son and the woman who took his life. And as for the inmates at Millbrook, the shadows of what had happened there lingered. It became a cautionary tale, a story whispered through the cells, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, the truth would eventually come to light. In the end, Karen Sanders had killed to protect her secret, but the secret came out anyway. And as she sat alone in her cell, just another prisoner in the system she once controlled, she had all the time in the world to think about how everything had gone so wrong. The truth, as it always does, had found a way to be told. While Karen Sanders served her life sentence, the true impact of her actions continued to ripple through the lives of those connected to the case. Millbrook Correctional Facility, now under new management, tried to repair its tarnished reputation. Still, the stains left behind by Sanders' actions couldn't be washed away so easily. James Reed's mother, Evelyn, became a recluse. Once a vibrant woman who worked tirelessly to support her son during his incarceration, she now lived in quiet isolation. The media frenzy around the case had subsided, but Evelyn's pain never did. She spent her days going through old letters that James had sent her from prison, wondering if she had missed any signs. Could she have done something to stop it? Was there a way her son could have escaped the clutches of Sanders before things spiraled out of control? Evelyn had long since accepted that James wasn't a perfect man. He had made mistakes, but he didn't deserve to die in such a cruel and senseless manner. As she sat in her small, dimly lit home, surrounded by memories of her son, she thought about the day he was sentenced, the day her world collapsed. Inside the prison walls, James Reed had tried to survive like any other inmate. He kept his head down, avoided trouble when he could, and stuck with a small group of inmates he trusted. But the day Karen Sanders took an interest in him, everything changed. At first it seemed harmless. Sanders had been kind to him, offering small gestures like extra food or the occasional break from work duty. It wasn't uncommon for officers to show favoritism to inmates they liked, so Reed didn't think much of it. But as time went on, Sanders' behavior became more invasive. She began seeking him out during her shifts, finding excuses to talk to him, even when there was no reason. Reed didn't know how to respond. He had been in prison long enough to know that crossing an officer could have serious consequences. But rejecting Sanders' advances felt equally dangerous. When she started making more personal remarks, Reed tried to keep his distance, but it wasn't easy. Sanders held all the power and he knew it. In the weeks leading up to his death, Reed confided in one of his fellow inmates about the situation. "She's crazy," he said. "She won't leave me alone. I don't know what to do." The other inmate, a man named Derek, told him to stay low and avoid making her angry. "You don't want to get on her bad side," Derek warned. "You've seen what she's capable of." Reed tried to take Derek's advice, but it was too late. Sanders had already crossed the line and there was no going back. As the years passed, the case of Karen Sanders and James Reed became a distant memory for the public, but for those involved, it was a wound that never fully healed. The investigation into Millbrook Correctional Facility had brought about significant changes, but the emotional toll remained. Laura Barnes, the journalist who had exposed the darker side of the prison, found herself unable to shake the weight of the story. She had covered many cases in her career, but this one stuck with her. The idea that someone in a position of authority could abuse their power in such a devastating way haunted her. It wasn't just about Reed's murder, it was about the countless other inmates who had suffered in silence, too afraid to speak up. In the years following the trial, Laura wrote a book about the case, detailing the corruption within the prison system and the lives that had been ruined because of it. The book became a bestseller, bringing more attention to the issues she had uncovered. But even as her career soared, Laura couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of guilt. She had brought the truth to light, but it had come at a great cost. Evelyn Reed, after much persuasion, agreed to speak with Laura for the book. Their conversations were emotional, filled with stories of James' childhood and the kind of person he had been before his life took a wrong turn. Evelyn's pain was palpable, but there was also a quiet strength in her words. She had lost her son, but she refused to let his memory be defined by the crime he was involved in or the way he had died. Karen Sanders had been convicted and sentenced, but many still questioned whether true justice had been served. The case had exposed deep flaws in the prison system, but for every reform made, there were still cracks. Abuse of power, corruption, and the mistreatment of inmates were problems that couldn't be solved overnight. Inside her cell, Sanders remained defiant. She refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, claiming that Reed had been a threat to her and that she had acted in self-defense. But her excuses rang hollow. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her cold, calculated demeanor during the trial had only cemented her guilt in the eyes of the public. Yet, despite her conviction, some still wondered if Sanders had been the product of a broken system, one that fostered cruelty and desensitized its officers to the humanity of the inmates they oversaw. Could things have been different if the system itself hadn't been so flawed? As Karen Sanders sat in her prison cell, a former officer now stripped of her authority, she had all the time in the world to reflect on her actions. But whether she ever felt remorse, no one knew for sure. The story of James Reed and Karen Sanders became a cautionary tale for the criminal justice system. It was a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of what could happen when the line between right and wrong blurred behind prison walls. For Evelyn Reed, life would never be the same. She continued to visit James' grave every week, leaving flowers and sitting in silence, reflecting on the son she had lost. The pain of his death was a constant presence in her life, but she found solace in knowing that his story had sparked change. For Laura Barnes, the case had been a career-defining moment. But more than that, it had reinforced her belief in the power of truth. No matter how painful or difficult it might be to uncover, the truth needed to be told. And in this case, it had made all the difference. In the end, the case of Karen Sanders and James Reed left behind a legacy of questions about justice, power, and the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. It was a story that would continue to resonate for years to come, a haunting reminder of the darkness that could exist in even the most unlikely places. And as the years passed, the memory of what had happened at Millbrook Correctional Facility would never fully fade, serving as a warning to those who believed that they could act without consequences. The truth always finds a way out.